Joining us here on Live Now from Fox is Stephen Gutowski, founding editor of The Reload. And Stephen, thanks so much for being with us. It's been now a week since the mass shooting there at Robb Elementary in Uvalde, Texas. And now the discussion, as is so often the case after these mass casualty incidents, has now transpired into what will Congress do, if anything, at all. And we got this readout from a virtual meeting that happened between a handful of senators today, including Senator John Cornyn, the Republican of Texas, and Senator Chris Murphy, the Democrat from Connecticut. Cornyn says Senators Murphy, Sinema, Tillis, and I had a very constructive conversation about the best response to the horrific events in Uvalde last week. We've asked our staff to continue to work together to address some of the details that we hope to be able to discuss at some point soon. They are coming together today to reach some semblance of a framework moving forward. We know that's kind of vague. Are you confident that there will be anything done as far as gun reform legislation? And what are some of the theories, ideas that are percolating out there on Capitol Hill that you are focused on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be difficult to come to a bipartisan agreement where you can cobble together 10 votes on any particular package. It'll be something that would require a lot of give on both ends, I think. And obviously that hasn't been something Congress has been willing to do in quite a long time on nearly any issue. And guns is a particularly heated issue, of course, with a lot of very strongly held beliefs on each side of that issue. But as far as the policies go, what they're focused on, it sounds like red flag laws is one of the top potential agreement points, some sort of red flag proposal, probably something closer to what Senator Lindsey Graham had done hearings on back a couple years ago after the Parkland shooting, which was more of a federal model legislation bill that included, perhaps funding for the states to implement such bills. It's sort of the way that Congress has gotten states to mandate seatbelt laws, that sort of funding. There isn't a federal seatbelt requirement. Instead, they offer funding to states that enforce their own seatbelt requirement. And so you're likely to see that as a more of the model for doing this kind of legislation on a red flag basis, because it's unlikely that the federal courts will be used for red flag orders. The state courts are much better suited for that sort of thing, where you need quick follow-up hearings on these sorts of orders because of the sensitive nature of a red flag order dealing with the constitutional right and having to have that sort of due process protection that has been critical to why they haven't passed in some states to this point, especially red states. That seems more likely to me than a universal background check bill or an assault weapons ban. And I don't think the House is even considering an assault weapons ban at this point. They haven't passed one so far in the President Biden's term, and Politico had reported that it's not part of their package that they're putting forth either. So, if you're looking for something at the federal level, it's probably going to hang on red flag bills and maybe some sort of school security program. Senator Grassley had a bill dealing with expanding the Secret Service's threat assessment operation to encompass school threats. So maybe some sort of combination of those kinds of proposals that aren't completely off the table for every senator, right? The universal background checks and assault weapons ban, people are so dug in on those issues and have been for 30 years that it's unlikely that they're going to find some sort of magic solution to that problem, in the next week or two.
So today we heard from Speaker Pelosi on the gun bills up in the House for next week. She says, we're filing our bill on gun violence and we just have to have background checks, raise the age, store them properly. She says background checks would save the most lives, but she says there are other things we can do to reduce the access. Senator Mitch McConnell on guns today, he was highlighting the virtual meeting between Senators Murphy and Cornyn today. He said, we'll get back at it next week and hope to have a result. Senator Murphy says he is somewhat optimistic that there could be some incremental change, even so much so than anything that was, I guess, not done after the Sandy Hook shooting 2 years ago. But I want to get your opinion on something President Biden said over the weekend as he was coming back from Uvalde with the First Lady, visiting that community. He talked about possibly banning 9mm handguns. Where do you think that came from, and would that help, and how would you even do that?
Yeah, often the president will speak off the cuff and say things that perhaps are not actual policy proposals that his administration is willing to put forth, but something that he personally believes. That seems to be how the White House often handles these kinds of things, because there isn't a proposal from the White House to ban 9mm handguns. I mean, that would encompass most handguns in the United States. And of the policies out there for gun control, that banning handguns is the least popular. I believe there's something like maybe 17 to 18% of Americans believe in a ban on handgun ownership, which is obviously vastly different from things like universal background checks or even assault weapons bans. But obviously it's probably not something the administration is going to actually make a push for, even though that it clearly seems to be something the president personally believes in. Okay. And I think it would be difficult to actually implement something like that, because it goes directly against what the Supreme Court has actually ruled in Heller, which was about Washington, D.C.'s total ban on handgun ownership. The court said that doesn't work with the Second Amendment. So that kind of policy is going nowhere for sure. Okay, and then finding common ground is very hard. Obviously, Democrats would need 10 Republican senators to buy into, like you said, any type of reform proposal, but also about, like you had mentioned, school security, school safety, putting more resource officers in schools, making sure doors are locked, and the like. Do you think that's going to be an element of this? And I also want to get your opinion as well about raising the age to buy certain firearms from 18 to 21. That seems to be talked about quite a lot in the past week. Yeah, I think that school hardening would have to be part of a federal deal if there's going to be one, because that is the primary policy response that Republicans believe in for these sorts of school shootings. Of course, now Democrats largely view that as distraction or an excuse not to go for gun control. So a lot of them are skeptical about doing policies like that, even if it's fairly popular concept out there that schools should be more secured than they currently are. So that's just how the political debate breaks down there. But you would certainly have to see something like that in any sort of compromise package, I would imagine, that went along with a red flag bill, or obviously there has been talk of raising the age to buy AR-15s and similar firearms, what people call assault weapons, from 18 to 21, because the handgun purchase age in the United States at the federal level is 21 years old. You've seen a couple of states, there's 8 states that have the 21-year age limit for purchasing AR-15s and similar firearms. California and Florida is one of them. Again, after Sandy Hook, they passed that reform, that restriction. Those have been challenged in court, and in fact, California's ban was actually just struck down by a federal court in the Ninth Circuit by a panel of judges there. So it's obviously legally controversial and probably not something that you're going to see pass in the Senate. I think gun bans are probably are too far of a reach with a 50-50 Senate. Anything that even an age restricted one, there's some possibility you could see Texas do it itself. Like I said, Florida did it after Parkland. There's fairly similar states in terms of the political makeup, although Texas hasn't. Texas leaders, Governor Abbott has not indicated that he's considering something like that to this point. So it doesn't appear to be something on the table right now, but it's certainly a possibility given what Florida did. So But I think the federal level, it's not likely to make it into a package unless it's some very, very expansive package that includes a lot of different things. Which
of course,
unlikely.
yeah, and lawmakers are still very far away from any type of really tangible ideas, tangible agreements. But what do you make of the conversation, the debate? You followed the aftermath of so many mass shootings as well, and it leads to the debate, especially on the right, where the worries go about confiscation. That's kind of the extreme level altogether. And then on the left, of course, you hear the discourse about banning certain classes and types of firearms outright and altogether. Are you still seeing it kind of fracture on those fault lines, or have you seen some accommodations on both sides? Because these sides are very, very dug in. We know that.
Yeah, I mean, look, when you have a shooting of this severity, when it involves elementary school children, that puts a lot of pressure on politicians to do something. As much as of a cliche as that's become, it is true. There's a lot of political pressure to address the problem. People don't want to feel like nothing is being done to respond to this horrible attack. Now, the big problem, as you just pointed out there, is the idea over what to do. They're very different depending on which side of the aisle you fall on. Democrats and liberals generally want more gun restrictions, including gun bans, and Republicans and conservatives want more school security, and in fact, including arming more people inside of the school, and whether it's school resource officers or teachers. So those two solutions are very far apart, of course, and it's very difficult to find that common ground. And so that's often why you get a lot of policies that don't necessarily directly relate to the shooting. Universal background checks get brought up a lot because they poll very well, not necessarily because they would have prevented either one of these shootings. They wouldn't have, because both of these, in Buffalo and Texas, both of these shooters passed background checks. Red flag laws, it's a little more of a possibility that it could have prevented either one of these shootings, but of course they have that policy in New York and it wasn't employed. So there's just never going to be one simple policy solution that you can flip a switch and solve all of the issues. And given the nature of our politics being so polarized these days on practically every issue, and this one being very, very much at the core of a lot of people's beliefs on either side, it's just very hard to get to something. But the only reason I would say it's possible is because of the nature of this attack and the victims, and how much political pressure that brings to find some sort of solution.
Stephen, you've been very outspoken on Twitter, particularly about the inadequate response from law enforcement to the school and to breach the classroom as the shooting was taking place. We know that officers had classified it as a barricade situation and not an active shooter situation. We're getting new information in the last few minutes, this by the Associated Press, from Texas authorities that now say that door that we were told was propped open by a teacher was not in fact propped open, but closed and left unlocked. So that kind of angle of all of this as far as the kind of course of events and the timeline has changed several times, has changed dramatically. These are just kind of more chinks in the armor of this failure of a response. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's something where when I think about the law enforcement response here and the decisions that were made, it makes me very angry, to be very frank with you. I've done active shooter training on several occasions, including with a group called Faster Colorado that trains teachers with law enforcement who have responded to school shootings on how to deal with them and how to deal with active shooter situations inside schools. And the response here was just horrendous. It's the exact opposite of everything that you're taught when you go through active shooter training. You are supposed to go and immediately confront the shooter as soon as you can. That's the number one priority in every active shooter training since Columbine. It's not a new concept, and it's one that this law enforcement agency was taught in fact, they had an active shooter training just a few weeks before this event happened. And it's the failings that occurred here got children killed. They just did. And it's horrendous. And the fact that the local police department may no longer be cooperating with the investigation into why these failures were made is a scandal in and of itself, in my opinion. People need to be held accountable for the decisions that were made here. I do not understand, and I will never understand, why it was decided that they should allow that shooter free reign inside of that classroom for upwards of an hour. It's inexplicable. There's no excuse. Even if you determine that it was a barricaded situation and he was done shooting, you're effectively committing those children who were bleeding to a death sentence by not intervening immediately. It's unthinkable. I literally cannot fathom how these decisions were made. And it's something that now we need to go through and thoroughly investigate what happened, who made what calls, and how they should be held responsible afterwards. This is such a serious and unbelievable breach of public trust that it's difficult to imagine an outcome that's going to fully restore it.
Yeah. So we know the Department of Justice is now investigating the law enforcement response at the request of the Uvalde, Texas mayor. And we also know, and I want to get your opinion on this and get you to respond. Now more of the fact pattern is still changing. The story is still changing now a week later. What does that do, though, to the credibility of the Texas Rangers who are providing this information on Friday at their press conference? They say they are just worried about the facts and they want to get the facts straight. But we have seen time and time again over the last week, these particular kind of bites of the story have changed sometimes 3 or 4 times. Do you think the community of Uvalde can have trust in their law enforcement to give them the accurate information going forward?
Man, certainly as these situations happen, you can get initial reports that don't turn out to be fully accurate. As everyone knows who works in media or has ever watched media coverage of an unfolding breaking news event. But the way that this story has changed multiple times in extremely significant details is very, very concerning. And it certainly undermines public trust in what the law enforcement officials in Texas are saying. And it's going to be difficult to rebuild that. I don't know how you do. This is got to be the most serious possible situation that you could come up with. And if the police in Texas can't give us straightforward answers on what happened and why within a reasonable amount of time, then they deserve to be questioned vigorously. And the community is rightful in being outraged about it.
Yeah. Stephen, you just got back from Houston, where you were reporting for The Reload, of course, the NRA's annual meeting there over the long holiday weekend. I just wanted your thoughts. Was this on the top of mind for a lot of the attendees for the annual meeting? We heard President Biden's address the night the shooting took place, where he essentially went after, and he said it by name, the powerful gun lobby. Of course, the NRA is the very most powerful gun lobby. Was it on the top of mind for many attendees? We know Texas Governor Greg Abbott did not show up in person. He had kind of a pre-recorded speech that was aired, that was played. But how much of Uvalde was in the atmosphere at the NRA's meeting?
Well, certainly there were moments of silence and there were prayers offered for the victims of the attack during the event. And I'm sure it was on the mind of every attendee there. However, the event overall felt more similar to a normal annual meeting. This is an event where people come to see the latest firearms that are on the market, to hear from their political leaders inside of the NRA or the Republican Party, and oftentimes during speeches about what's going on with gun rights, which they care deeply about. And so certainly there were moments where the shooting was top of mind or center of the attention, but it wasn't, of course, the continual focus of the event, because I mean, it's the kind of event it is, that, you know, it's a convention. It would be difficult to have the shooting be the entire focus of it, to be fair to the attendees. But yeah, that was the atmosphere. I felt it was very similar to previous annual meetings and most of the time, except for the attendance was way down. Although, to be fair, there were protests, of course, but there are protests at most of these annual meetings. So that wasn't necessarily different. And I would say that the protest size actually wasn't any bigger than, at least not much bigger than previous years where there have been protests at the annual meeting. So I guess at the end of the day, most Americans weren't eager to go out to that event on one side or the other.
Okay. I want to get your just final thoughts on something our neighbors to the north, Canada, are doing. Apparently, new gun control legislation is being introduced there, and it has to do with a national freeze in Canada on the purchase, the sale, and the importation and transfer of handguns there. This has the full backing of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Is this because there is, a rise in, homicides or similar violence in Canada, or do you think this is in direct response to the violence that we're seeing in the United States? Not that, another country would base their laws on something we are doing, but where do you think this is coming from in Canada?
Well, I mean, Trudeau himself said it was a direct response to the shooting in Uvalde. So, obviously he also discussed the rising crime rate in Canada as well. It's something we've also seen here in America, and which is where handguns are utilized more often in sort of your criminal acts of violence, both in Canada and the United States. So certainly it's probably a mix of the two, but I don't think it's a coincidence that he announced his plan to introduce that legislation in the immediate aftermath of one of the worst school shootings in North American history. Obviously, it comes on the heels of his previous legislation to ban AR-15s and confiscate them from people who already own them in Canada. So, and I mean, this proposal is to ban the sale, new sales, and allow current owners to keep their firearms. But given that he quite literally just issued a confiscation order for people who had legally owned AR-15s up to 2 years ago, I don't know how much Canadian gun owners can trust that declaration at this point.
Of course, we saw just earlier today the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern visiting the White House, speaking with President Biden. And of course, we know the horrible tragedy that happened at the mosque in Christchurch back in 2019 that left more than 50 people dead. New Zealand took very swift gun control measures and gun confiscation measures, frankly, after that shooting, initializing a law that went into effect very rapidly. And so you're hearing that a lot in relation to this meeting that was happening today. Does that have any purchase?
I think that mainly the effect of both the Canadian ban and President Biden meeting with the New Zealand Prime Minister, who instituted her own gun confiscation effort, is going to be on American domestic politics and making it more difficult to pass any sort of gun restrictions here, because one of the major sticking points for gun rights activists and Republican lawmakers is the fact that they don't believe that gun control activists want to stop at universal background checks or red flag laws or any of these other proposals, and it makes them less inclined to cooperate or compromise, because they believe that the true goal is to institute a gun confiscation program like what Canada and New Zealand have done. And I mean, honestly, the president meeting with somebody who's put that policy in place is going to do very little to disabuse people from that notion, right? And the fact that Canada is instituting or wants to institute a handgun ban hasn't drawn any sort of criticism from American gun control advocates. Perhaps gives gun rights advocates a feeling of vindication in that they believe that that's what they want to do here. I mean,
somewhat of a telltale
that's how it complicates
sign.
it.
Yeah. Yeah. Stephen Gutowski, as always, we appreciate your time, and we'll talk to you again on this topic.
Thank you.